Hey, welcome to Raw Paints Models. In today's episode we're going to be making some junkyard bases and painting them. Now these bases work really well for orc armies, you know, with all their looting and stuff going on, all their scrap lying around. They look really good for that, and I use them on my orc kill team and the rest of my orc army for 40k. Now these bases are made out of Plasticard, so I'm using a couple of textured sheets of Plasticard. This is some diamond tread plate Plasticard. It's very, very thin. You can see there it's super, super thin. And this is going to form one of our textured pieces. I've also got some scraps of untextured Plasticard which I'll be using. This is some corrugated Plasticard. This is much thicker, mostly due to the corrugated texture. It's hard to see on the camera there. But this is a very, very fine corrugated Plasticard. I got all of this Plasticard from greenstuffworld.com. There'll be a link in the description below where you can get this stuff from. I also used a bunch of stuff from my bits box. So take your base and roughly figure out how big of an area of plastic that you're going to want to cut off. These are 32mm bases. I'm also making some 25s in this batch. I'll be showing you on a 32mm base here. Get a steel ruler, very useful for doing this, and a sharp X-Acto blade, and you want to score the untextured side of the Plasticard. Now you don't need to cut all the way through because Plasticard will typically snap once you've scored it, and I'll show you that in a moment. But take note, the corrugated Plasticard is actually pretty hard to snap because it's thick, and the texture of the corrugation on the other side actually kind of gives it a lot of structure and holds it together pretty well. So you might end up actually having to kind of peel it apart. It's a bit of a weird process. As you can see, I'm having difficulty snapping that. It has gotten a gap, but it's still connected by the textured area rather than the actual sheet. So just go over it again with your X-Acto blade and just deepen the cut. You don't have to cut all the way through. You might want to put a cutting mat down to protect your table. This table is already completely dead, it's knackered, so I don't worry about using a cutting mat here. And once you've got a nice, you know, oddly shaped piece of Plasticard that's about the right size, move on to making some more. I did all of this in a big batch. I just cut out huge amounts of Plasticard that the amount I thought I would need for making all of my bases, and I had some left over at the end. As you can see, the brown stuff being so much thinner, and the thinner does work better for this scale. Snaps off super easy. So get your base and start figuring out how you want to kind of lay out these Plasticards. I found the best way is to kind of layer them up, stack them on top of each other, create overlapping areas. Looks like just, you know, a literal junkyard full of sheets of discarded metal. So now we're going to distress and otherwise warp the Plasticard into junk shapes. So our first piece is pretty squared off, not much bends going in it, not much damaged looking areas, so I'm just using some clippers and some brute force in order to force it into some bent and torn up shapes that makes it look like it's old scrap from damaged buildings or old vehicle armor plates or something like that that's just been abandoned. I'm also using my pin vise to drill a few holes in to make bullet holes, and then taking my X-Acto blade and just kind of gouging out areas in order to make it look like areas of the metal have chipped off as they've been hit by bullets and ricochets. Basically, there's no wrong way to do all of this stuff. Just I'm not even thinking when I'm doing this stuff. I'm just looking at a piece of Plasticard and just going right, and turning off my brain and just grabbing my clippers and just grabbing the Plasticard, warping, clipping until it looks kind of like a thing. The reality is that, you know, battle damage is so random. If you think about it too much, then it's not going to look natural. So here I'm using a piece of an offcut of some 1mm regular Plasticard. I'm just taking my X-Acto blade and I'm just cutting along the corners to try and create, it's not really a bevel, but a damaged bevel, I guess. It's not uniform along the entire length, but it just kind of takes that square edge off where I've scored it. and makes it look a bit more junkyardy. damaged, I guess. I'm also taking off some of the very pointy corners. Again, it just makes it look a little bit more natural, which is a weird thing to say about junkyard scrap. And just giving it a bit of a bend. Now Plasticard, I find it's just easiest to attach it to the base with super glue. You can use plastic glue, it is polystyrene and it will work with plastic glue, but I found generally that super glue is just much easier to work with in these particular instances, because the super glue will bulk up and create an area of plastic that is supporting the glue, whereas if the plastic cement, you have to have the two surfaces constantly touching. The super glue will, if necessary, fill the gap between them and allow you to build up and allow a bit of flex between the bits of plastic. So you can see I've decided that once I've got it all glued together, it needs a little bit more damage, just to make it a little bit less squared off. So I'm cutting off that corner there, making a bit more of an indentation. Again, not really thinking too hard about it. I'm taking some of my bits that I've earmarked for my bases here, chosen a bit of railing off a Goliath tank, I think it is, the big truck. I had some of this spare in my bits box. I'm just bending it around, hiding the areas which look a bit weird, and sticking it under the Plasticard with some super glue. So now we're going to apply some texture to our junkyard bases. This is just to make it look like it's actually on an earthy surface. This is a bird sand that I'm using. It's sand for bird cages. And I'm going to be attaching this with some PVA glue. I'm going to be using a couple of different grains of texture here. So the bird sand is like the bulky, big, small stones. Like when it scales up, it looks like small stones. It won't look like sand. It's way too big to actually be sand or even dirt. This kind of sand is much better for doing small stones. So you want this in little patches. You don't want too much of this in any one location. So I'm just taking some PVA glue and a brush. This is just a GW dry brush. PVA glue being water-based, it actually washes out of brushes quite easily. So I'm just tapping it in areas where I want some of the sand to adhere. And then I'm taking my base after I clean my brush off. And I'm just, splat in the bird sand, give it a jiggle, knock off the stuff that hasn't stuck and wipe it off any areas where I don't want it to be. So for example, classic thing that happens with this is usually get some glue on the underside of the Plasticard, and I'm going to use my X-Acto blade to just kind of scrape off the glue, the sand that is stuck to the underside of the Plasticard, because that's not realistic. Sand and stones wouldn't stick to the underside of Plasticard, well, of steel. It wouldn't stick to the underside of anything. Gravity would take care of that, so we need to just poke that off. And it's gone. And yeah, just use your thumb, spread it out. A lot of the sand will fall off once it's dried. Don't worry about this too much. Everything random that happens to your base is a good thing. So you can see I've done all of my batch with the sand. Next, I'm going to water down my PVA glue, so it's a much thinner consistency, and I'm going to use some baking powder. You could also use baking soda, it's all the same stuff really. Just the important thing is the texture, and we don't worry about it yellowing or anything because we're going to paint over it. So take some watered down PVA glue and spread this around our sand, any areas where we want the layer of sand and dust to appear on the junkyard. You can also use this for a kind of super heavily oxidized rust effect, where it's added a lot of texture to the surface of the metal. Again, you'll just be able to wipe it off with your thumb afterwards. So take some baking powder and go sprinkly, when most likely it'll just go out of the pot. There we go. Do this on some newspaper if you're worried about losing some. This is a really old pot of baking powder that has never been used for actually cooking anything. Once I got my hands on it anyway. And we have some baking powder. Now, this will come off. So once it's dry, you'll probably want to get a big soft brush and just give it a brush so that all the stuff that's going to come off comes off. But it can take a couple of hours for the PVA glue to fully dry. So as you can see, I'm just kind of removing some in areas that I don't necessarily want it. This brush has just got some water on it, and I'm just using that to clean off any areas where I don't want the dust to have settled. So you can see that a lot of it's actually just falling straight off and leaving behind a very subtle texture. And once all your bases are dry, it's time to paint them. I'm priming them with Vallejo Surface Primer with an airbrush. I actually recommend that you use an automotive primer, it'll stick better. So now I'm going to go through with my airbrush, and I'm just going to base coat all of the metal parts with some Doombull Brown over that black. I'm not worrying about getting full coverage at this point, because we're just building up a rust effect which we're going to paint over again later. So just creating a nice mottled pattern on all of that metal, and then going in with Scrag Brown, doing the same thing, just random mottled patterns any way you think different colours of rust will be. Again, the more random you make it, the better it'll look in the end. So next we're going with Fire Dragon Bright. It's slightly nicer than Torchlight Orange. This is a bit more desaturated and it covers a little bit better. Also transitions us more nicely to the next colour, which will be Avalon Sunset. This is a kind of ochre colour rather than a bright yellow, which you just use it a little thinly over what you've done and it just makes it look like some really super old rust. Once that's all dry, take some Necron Compound and your dry brush. Give it a good clean on some tissue paper. And dry brush all of your metal areas. Now during this stage, it is very likely that you might knock some of the sand off if it hasn't stuck on fully. But don't worry about that at this point. If you don't want your sand to come off, then I advise going back in with some watered PVA glue, very thin watered down PVA glue, and applying it over the top of the sand that you've applied, and it should seal it onto the base better, but it just takes a lot longer to dry, and I was kind of in a hurry. As you can see, this picks out all of the little raised areas on that textured Plasticard really nicely. Now I'm going to use some, this is Green Stuff World Liquid Mask. This is basically just liquid latex. You can get this from a whole bunch of different suppliers. I'm using a bit of sponge. This is another Green Stuff World weathering stick. This video is not sponsored, by the way. I just happen to have all this stuff lying around. And I'm using the liquid mask on the sponge in order to create some areas where there will be paint chipping. So essentially what we're doing is saying anything that's under this liquid mask, that's going to be rust once we've finished painting it. Some areas you may want it to be heavier than others. You don't need to worry about going over the areas with the sand because we're just going to paint over that at the end with a dust effect. Now you need to wait for this to dry. Once it's dried, it will have gone transparent. There'll be a little kind of slight blue tint to it. Now we're taking our colours, we're going to paint the metal. I'm using VMA Pale Blue here, but you can use any colours you want for this step. And then I'm going to use Duck Egg Green on some other ones. I'm just going over them fairly haphazardly with the airbrush, painting in those areas. I find that these colours contrast really nicely against the metallic rust effects. And once everything is dry, you can just take your thumb and peel off that liquid mask. Now you want to be careful here because you might peel up some of your sand, and the primer doesn't always stick great to the white Plasticards I've found. It's a little bit too shiny, that's why I advise using an automotive primer instead. So you can see here some of the Plasticard on the white and the brown areas has come through. This happened because I didn't seal my sand with some watered down PVA glue, and I didn't use a strong enough primer. So again, using a automotive primer or a spray can rattle can primer rather than the Vallejo stuff sticks better to Plasticard. The Vallejo stuff sticks great to regular models, but to Plasticard, which is super shiny, you either need to scratch it up with a piece of sandpaper beforehand, or use a rattle can primer and it will stick much better. But again, the sand came off because I didn't apply PVA glue back over the top. But this isn't a big problem, because now I'm taking some Xantry dust, and through my airbrush I am going to paint in some dust and sand effects over the areas where the dust and sand is. So again, this will go over the Plasticard and it will cover quite nicely. You don't really need to worry about priming it. You're not going to notice at the end where all of these areas are. Now I'm laying it on pretty heavy here because I want it to be quite a dusty looking base, but the amount that you use here is entirely up to you. If you want more of the metal showing, then that's up to you. Now this step is completely optional, it depends how much contrast you want. I wanted more contrast on the corrugated sections and around the dust, so I applied some Agrax Earthshade on the areas where the texture was. I was just feathering it out with some water on areas where I didn't want it to be too dark, and then I'm going back with Xantry dust and just painting that back over the sandy areas very, very gently. Not much going on with this compared to before, just kind of bringing the colour back up a bit. I'm taking some Terminatus Stone, the air version, not the dry version. You could use the dry version and give it a quick dry brush over the sand if you wanted. I'm just using this, just painting a little bit of a lighter dust colour in a few areas, just, you know, relatively randomly. And once we're done, we need to pin our models onto their bases. So just use your pin vise, drill a hole into the foot, use a bit of paper clip, drill a hole into the base, and attach your models that way. These guys won't ever come off their bases as a result of this. Makes it very easy to do your bases separately from your models if you do it this way. So you can see here, paper clip sticking through. This guy, one in each foot. They're going to be super stable, they're never going to come off. Just a little dab of super glue to help keep them on their bases. And the job is a good one. There we go, some junkyard bases to put your orcs and all that such like thing on. Thank you to all of my patrons. You can see all of their names scrolling past now. All of their support is greatly appreciated. They're the only ones that keep this channel going. They're the ones that make it what it is. You can subscribe in the top left there. Please do that thing. Also click the bell for notifications. You can watch another video up there. YouTube decides what's going there. And check out my social medias where you can follow me for work in progress updates and all sorts of witty banter. Not really. Bye.